Whakarongo, dein Neuseeland Podcast.
Und damit sagen wir mal wieder herzlich willkommen zur neuen Folge, allerdings einer sehr speziellen Folge. Wir sind bei Rebecca zu Hause. Rebecca stellt sich kurz vor.
Ja, hallo, hier ist Rebecca wieder.
Ich dachte, du sagst mal deinen Nachnamen. Rebecca Burke,
Ja.
Unsere Neuseeland-Expertin. Und ja, wir sind bei ihr, mein Name Daniel Kuhr übrigens, wir sind bei dir heute zu Hause, weil wir einen Gast haben.
Genau, wir haben heute einen Gast aus Neuseeland, der hier bei mir zu Hause auf dem Sofa sitzt.
Magst du vorstellen?
Ja, kann ich. Wir haben heute hier die wunderbare Leimomi Oakes sitzen, die ihres Zeichens eigentlich aus Hawaii kommt, aber ihr gesamtes Erwachsenenleben schon in Neuseeland lebt.
Und da sehr interessante Sachen macht. Und genau darüber wollen wir reden. Aber, jetzt kommt der Disclaimer, das machen wir nicht auf Deutsch. Und wir werden auch kein Overvoice machen. Wir gehen davon aus, dass alle Neuseeland-Interessierten natürlich auch des Englischen mächtig sind. Wobei das gerade der Richtige sagt an der Stelle. Denn ich habe schon gesagt, eingangs dieser Gesprächssituation, dass mein Englisch einfach so eingerostet ist. Und ihr euch so lange kenne, dass ich lehne mich zurück, ich lasse euch quatschen. Nein, nicht ganz, ne? Aber ihr habt euch schon natürlich so ein bisschen eingegroovt dann halt tatsächlich auch, ne?
Ja, so ein bisschen. Ich hoffe, es klappt. Mal gucken, mein Englisch ist auch schon ein bisschen eingerostet, aber es sollte reichen.
Ich merke davon nichts. Jetzt ist natürlich gemein, wir unterhalten uns hier die ganze Zeit und sagen nicht mal Hallo zu unserem Gast. We say hello to you.
Hello, delighted to be here.
So, you just talked with each other what the first topic is our first topic. So tell us, Rebecca.
Yes, so I thought we first talk a little bit about how we met, because I think lots of people might be interested in how I met a Hawaiian girl in New Zealand.
It's a story I don't know. Huh?
So we were both working for Te Papa, which is the National Museum of New Zealand. And we had a mutual friend, another German, who I first met when I was a student in New Zealand. And I do not remember the moment when we met, but at some point in my life, suddenly I knew Rebecca and we were friends. And we both, worked for the same organization. And as we both moved on to other universities and museums, we stayed in touch, and you moved back to Germany, and we stayed in touch. And now I get to see you again, and it's wonderful.
So how many years has it been?
17, 16 since we first met, I think. Yeah.
Easily.
Yeah, 16 or 17, because I've been permanently in New Zealand since 2006. So we met in maybe 2007.
Yeah, round about that date, I would say.
Yes.
Yeah, but who counts years? I mean,
Feels like yesterday.
yes, it feels like yesterday. At least it felt like that when I picked you up from the airport.
Yeah. A few less gray hairs and kilos between us. Yeah. Better knees. Yeah.
It's okay. It's
Yes.
okay.
More knowledge.
Lots of more knowledge. I have learned a lot during those days that we've been together now.
Yes.
It was just lovely. So that's the reason why we thought we should just have a little bit of a discussion about what you do and the stuff you're passionate about.
Yes.
Because some people, if they Google your name online, they will find a lot of things about you.
Yeah.
There's a lot about me online.
Yeah. So do you want to share with our listeners a little bit what you do?
Sure. I am a fashion, textile, and social historian. But I'm also a costumer. So I teach costume construction at Toi Whakari, the New Zealand Drama School. And I make sewing patterns, digital PDF sewing patterns that you can buy online, mostly for historical clothes from the 1910s and the 18th century. And so I love the balance of doing very practical things that are with my hands, with the history. So I'm not just researching and writing all the time. But as a social historian, what I really like to do is explore history through putting on the clothes and living the life. So I actually really understand. We can read as much as we want about what it was like to wear a corset. But actually, if you wear a replica corset and you eat the meals and you do the household chores, you understand so much more about a corset than just reading about it, because you've actually felt, actually, it's really comfortable to do housework in a corset because you have this amazing back support. And so it's like a brace. And this is not an instrument of torture. This is actually something that, if you're living that lifestyle, can be really comfortable, of course, depending on the era and how fashionable and tight-laced your corset was. But yeah, that's what I do as a historian, try to really understand history as it was for the people who lived it then through food and dress, and supplemented by reading journals and newspapers and traditional research.
But can you explain, because it's a very special job, how you came into it? Because I think you put some of your interests together, as I suppose.
Yes. Oh, not a straightforward path into it. In university, I studied international relations with a focus on the Pacific, which is how I ended up in New Zealand. But I realized that I didn't want a government job working for an aid company. I would find that very hard. And so I worked in museums for years, which is how Rebecca and I met. And then I discovered I was really good at teaching. So I ended up teaching in universities and then teaching sewing. And then I was frustrated that there weren't good sewing patterns that you could buy in New Zealand because it was so far from everywhere else. So I started making sewing patterns. And then my particular historical research focus is domestic life in New Zealand during World War I, because World War I is incredibly formative for New Zealand as a country. A lot of historians really say in terms of national identity and how Kiwis think about themselves today, that's the big pivot point. It's the first point at which New Zealand, as a totally independent force, participates in a global conflict, and such a huge amount of New Zealanders, 1 in 10, served overseas during World War I, and such a huge proportion of those, almost 60% of the people who served overseas, were killed or injured. So that's 1 in 4 adult male Kiwis. So such a huge amount of people went overseas and got exposed to the world. And as an American, born and raised in America, and seeing our attitude towards war, and of course my parents' generation really campaigned against the Vietnam War, so they had a really mixed viewpoint, seeing how much in New Zealand, how reverent people are towards those who served in World War I and World War II. It was very different for me. So I started researching it, and I realized that there are so many books and journals published about the men who fought overseas, and there are their diaries, and there's a few books about the women who served as nurses, but there are almost no books about everybody who stayed home in New Zealand. And I thought, if you have 1 in 10 people leaving the country for up to 4 years for a conflict, you must have all these women running businesses by themselves for the first time, running farms by themselves for the first time, serving in offices in what were male roles. And then you have all these men who come home from overseas with new experience. And, there were men who'd never left their tiny, tiny 200-person town. Suddenly they've been all over Europe and Egypt. And I thought, why has no one researched that and written what life was like for them? And so that's what my area of historical research, and that's why it started going, there's this huge untold story. There is one published diary of a New Zealand woman who was a non-combatant New Zealand woman in World War I, and she spent the whole war in England. It's a great book. It's called Annie's War. But so you get a Kiwi perspective because she talks a lot about what it's like to be a New Zealander in England, but it's not what life was like in New Zealand.
Yeah, that's why I think lots of our listeners, for them it might be a surprise that New Zealand was actually participating in the war over here in Europe, because I remember in school I've never heard about the Anzac forces. So Anzac forces are New Zealand and Australian forces.
Yes, it's the Australia, New Zealand Army Corps.
Yeah, exactly.
And the Anzacs are all the men who fought in World War I and World War II, and they are national icons in Australia and New Zealand. Yeah. And Anzac Day is April 25th, and it is the anniversary of the first major action that New Zealand and Australian men saw when they landed at Gallipoli in Turkey.
Yeah.
But that, as a public holiday, is such a major day. But it's not really surprising that you haven't heard in Germany because, while it was major for New Zealand for 1 in 10 men to go, that's only 100,000 people because New Zealand only had a population of just over 1 million during World War I. So,
I think it's sad, but we didn't learn in school anything about New Zealand.
Yeah, that's true. We don't learn anything about New Zealand.
I mean, it's still a small country.
But it's interesting, though, because the country is so small and let's say the European history doesn't date that much back and the country is very small, and due to the smallness in terms of size and also people-wise, it is everything that happens on a small scale, but very, very fast. So historical events, you can see the outcome of things very fast and very strongly. So in terms of study, this is just perfect because you don't need to look over thousands of years to see the effect of something. You can see it rather fast.
And you can see the influence from Europe on such a small country. It's part of our history, and that isn't mentioned in school nowhere.
Yes. So this is really interesting for me because I was raised in Hawaii, which is even smaller than New Zealand. Hawaii now has a population of 1 million, and New Zealand has a population of 5 million right now. But for me, when I think about New Zealand during World War I with their 1 million, I can really compare it to growing up in Hawaii and how much everyone knows each other. And so when I think about 1 in 10 people leaving from Hawaii and how much you would notice that, and everyone would know hundreds of people who had left and hundreds of connections and the impact that would make. But also because I was raised in Hawaii, I have no experience of anywhere with a European history that dates back earlier than the 18th century. And so obviously both Hawaii and New Zealand have this amazing Polynesian history that dates back hundreds of years and that is absolutely fascinating. But in terms of European history, in both places, it only goes back a couple hundred years.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's why I choose my topic as well in New Zealand, because I thought it is very condensed. The European part of it is very condensed.
Yes. And I think that impact happens partly so quickly because it's small.
Yeah.
And so everyone knows each other. And so every national tragedy, people directly affected. And every national triumph, people directly affected.
Everyone knows someone who worked for Lord of the Rings.
Someone? 500 people who worked for Lord of the Rings. I work in drama. Students worked on Lord of the Rings. Manager worked on Lord of the Rings.
Everyone works for
Friends
Walter.
were extras in Lord of the Rings. Yeah.
And I think that's the first time young people came in something like contact to New Zealand because of this story and not in the school.
Yeah.
That's probably true. It certainly made New Zealand world famous, more than just world famous in New Zealand.
Everyone knows world famous in New Zealand.
Yeah.
I just say gumboot throwing.
Number 8 wire.
Yeah.
Which number 8 wire is a specific gauge of wire, and there's a New Zealand saying that you can fix anything with number 8 wire. Car door falls off, just tie it on. But during World War I, they wanted lots of knitting to send to the soldiers, and they could spin their own wool. So when there were fabric shortages from overseas, everyone was knitting jerseys, and there was a shortage of knitting needles, and they actually made knitting needles out of number 8 wire.
There you go.
And I feel like that is the ultimate New Zealand textile story. And I can't imagine how horrid it would be to knit with number 8 wire.
Everyone has to make sacrifices.
Just make do, make do.
This is really interesting. So I think as well for you listeners, this if you ever travel to New Zealand, you will find a lot of memorial places for World War I and World War II. And also if you happen to be there during Anzac Day, it is really interesting to participate in the Anzac ceremonies and just see what it does to people, because how war is remembered surely in a totally different way than in Germany, due to the fact that we have been the aggressor and the bad ones and we need to be ashamed. But, I remember when I arrived and I got in contact with this topic. And I mean, I was a historian already when I arrived, and I have studied Second World and First World War history actually extensively as well, I would say. I didn't know that New Zealand was part of it, not at all. I knew Australia, but I didn't know New Zealand. And then I thought, wow, damn, this is weird. Imagine you get shipped all across the world, all around the world, just to be killed. This is very dooming. And then when I was teaching at uni, I was teaching history papers. So I also was teaching the impact that World War I and II had on New Zealand society. And doing that as a German, that was very, very interesting. Because lots of people had particular views that I shouldn't teach that topic.
Oh.
So we had very interesting conversations around how we memorize those things, how we honor the people who fought, and the different things that we have learned at school around this. So it really turned into a huge cultural exchange over a couple of weeks, which was for me mind-blowing in a way, but also very eye-opening, I think, for the Kiwi students who, or let's say it like this, I mean, you touched on this already, that in the New Zealand psyche, these events have been major.
Yes.
And in the families, they left their scars, and you remember your grandfather who fought. So now the grandchildren wear their medals, and they go and honor those people in a way that is totally foreign to us here in Germany. And it made me sort of cringe in the beginning because I'm not used to it. But now, at the end, like before I left or after time I was there, I thought, oh, this is actually really good. It is really interesting to reconnect over the generations with those topics and retell the stories and keep it alive. And it has nothing to do really with killing someone or the actual badness of war, because we don't need to discuss this. It is about honoring someone who has been very brave and has done something that left a scar somewhere.
And I think New Zealand is there used to be a lot of adulation.
Yeah.
And they're still honoring, but New Zealand is also coming to terms with the parts of their participation in the war that weren't so good.
Yeah.
So one of those directly touches on you in that during both during World War I and World War II, there was a lot of anti-German sentiment, and people's shops were attacked if they had German last names, and some of them were not German at all. They were Belgian, or, Kiwis didn't know a lot about Germany like you didn't. So if it sounded vaguely German.
Yeah.
And one of the most striking things to me is during World War II, there's an island in the middle of Wellington Harbor that they used as an internment camp for foreign nationals. And they interned recent Jewish immigrants on the island indiscriminately. So about a third of them were, to some extent, supportive of the Nazi government in Germany. And the other 2/3 were people who had specifically fled the Nazi government. They were Jewish or they were political opponents. And all of these men got put in the same camp. And just by the New Zealand government indiscriminately. So that's a point of tension. Another one is New Zealand was really horrible to conscientious objectors during World War I, and in fact tortured and killed some of them. And we've only recently apologized to their families for that treatment. At the start of World War I, a lot of men were very enthusiastically signing up. And then as the war dragged on and people who had family obligations in their farm or were married were less, and the war just kept dragging, and they started hearing horrible stories of the trenches. By late 1916, people didn't want to sign up, and so they started conscripting men. And some of those men really didn't want to go, or a few men who went and then saw the horrors of war went, ooh, this is not the fun home by Christmas party we thought it would be. And so New Zealand's starting to balance their own history and have a more nuanced viewpoint, which I think is happening in a lot of New Zealand history. They're only just coming to terms with the wars where they were horrible aggressors and did really awful things to Maoris in New Zealand. And that sort of nuance is happening in all sorts of places. Can I tell a fun story about one of the things about World War I that I think is most interesting?
Yes.
Please.
Yes.
Go for it.
So in World War I, lots of women who were already nurses signed up as official Red Cross nurses. But other enthusiastic women also just wanted to be nurses. So one of them was a middle-aged woman named Etty Root, and she had an education, and she thought, I'll form my own nursing corps, and I'll take only women who are self-supporting and are over 30, so they have life experience and are probably not going to get in the kind of trouble that young women might get into. Make sure we avoid that. And so she formed her own nursing corps, and they went off to Europe, and they quickly discovered that because they weren't professional nurses, that was not the best use of their talents. But she was a very smart, savvy woman, and she looked around and went, what do all these young men who have left their farms in the thousands and are now in London and Paris really need? Sex education. And the New Zealand government's official line was, New Zealand men are sweet and pure and they will not get into any trouble overseas. So we don't need to give them any help in this. But imagine you're a 17-year-old boy who's left your farm in New Zealand where the expectation was that you'd get married and nothing would happen until then. And you couldn't, it was hard to get into trouble because you knew the parents of every girl in the neighborhood, and you're suddenly in Paris. And there are a lot of invitations. And so she started putting together pamphlets and packages of prophylactics and early condoms and things, and giving them out. And at first there was resistance from the New Zealand government because she was destroying the idea that New Zealand men were so upstanding that they would not get into any trouble. But then they realized that they were young men and this was actually very much needed. Otherwise, they were going to have a huge sexually transmitted disease outbreak. So they started accepting her packages, but it was very important to keep the myth at home. New Zealand had amazing censorship of the newspapers. When you read newspapers of that era, they're so careful of the war news. The newspapers are so cheerful, and so at one point there was a £300 fine for mentioning Etty Root's name in a New Zealand newspaper. £300 in 1916. That's a lot of money. And so her service was so amazing that she was recognized with a medal by the French government. But back in New Zealand, no, her name was a pariah. But it does mean, but she was really successful in this campaign, and it really helped keep things clean. And she'd give out lists of clean brothels in Paris. If you're going to get in trouble, do it safely. And so I think one of the things is that a whole bunch of young men went home with, for the first time ever, an actual sex education. And which was certainly not taught in schools, and the ability to teach their wives about contraception so that you could have kids when you wanted to have kids. And hopefully it also meant that far fewer men went home with sexually transmitted diseases that they passed on to their wives and girlfriends. And so that's just a fascinating facet. And that's also one of the things that only recently has New Zealand started to honor Etty Root for what she did, which is, not your usual war heroism, but actually probably saved a lot of lives and a lot of misery.
Did you know the story?
No, I didn't, but it's brilliant. It's one of these brilliant New Zealand stories.
And one of my patterns, it's for a petticoat, and it's the Etty petticoat after Etty Root. And I just think it's really funny that I named a petticoat after.
Yeah, you told me that lots of your patterns have names of women that did great things and that have been forgotten.
Yeah, and not necessarily great things, because I think it's important not to turn historical figures into saints. Like, people are nuanced people, and so I try not to venerate the figures. Etty Root, by all accounts, could be a bit demanding, and she probably struggled with depression. She had all sorts of nuances to her life, but in this particular, she did something that was really interesting that we should talk about, because it had a huge impact on New Zealand. Yeah.
I love this story. This is great. It goes in my repertoire.
There you go. And I can send you lots of links. But yes, Etty Root. Yes. All right, having talked about sexually transmitted diseases, where do we go from there?
I do not see Rebecca speechless. So very successful. Tell us more.
No, this is a really great story, because I think lots of people know that the woman's right to vote was first established in New Zealand, and they have a certain view on how women in New Zealand were. And I think as well nowadays, I think New Zealand women are a bit more feisty in a way sometimes, I think, and more independent and all that kind of stuff. So I think that story kind of fits in.
I mean, I think it's what country are you comparing it to?
Yes.
Because you say New Zealand women are feisty, but then Kiwis as a whole
I'm not. No.
are, New Zealand fought against Germany in World War I and World War II. But my impression is that very much the focus in recent years on the war memorials have been reconciliation. And we've really, particularly with Turkey, done a bunch of reconciliation, and the same with Germany. It's to try to make peace. So as a German tourist, you're unlikely to, be scolded as the descendants of people who fought in World War II. But Germans in New Zealand are sometimes, shall we say, teased or criticized for being very direct, when the Kiwi way of working is very indirect and very non-confrontational. And so sometimes in the workplace, the German directness conflicts with the Kiwi. Like, let's never directly say we don't like this idea. Let's just pretend, go, oh, nice idea, and then do something different. And so in that way, Kiwis are not feisty.
Yeah.
They can be very indirect. And certainly when you go tramping in New Zealand, which is a big thing, Kiwi trampers always complain about German trampers, because the Kiwi trampers want to stay up and party late and then wake up late in the morning and stroll off on their walk. And the German pet trampers want to go to bed nice and early and get up at the break of dawn. And then they wake all the Kiwi trampers up who have partied too late. Yes. So, feisty, yes. And
See, this is why I just was hanging with Kiwis all the time, because I was the person, let's have a party.
I've done both on tramps. And I think that the women rights in New Zealand have been really amazing. First country to get the right to vote, and a really also amazing suffrage campaign that was very focused on everyone getting the right to vote, and that had very prominent people in it who were very working class. And this is really in opposition to, say, the very famous English suffragists who really only wanted wealthy women to have the vote. And in New Zealand, they also were really determined that Maori women had the vote as well. So it's a really unusual campaign, and they get the vote early, and then 30 years later, they also get the right to run for office. They didn't get full suffrage until later. But then there have been ups and downs about, for a long time, New Zealand women were not allowed in pubs, only men. So it was hard to go out to eat as a woman. And so there have been real ups and downs in New Zealand, in women's rights in New Zealand. But there are, we've now had 3 female prime ministers, which, as an American who's never had a female president, obviously,
female governor generals.
Yes, a bunch of female governor generals. And we recently had a really landmark law trying to provide equal pay for equal work, which is to give, and so it's really started out to give nurses and care workers the same sort of money that more traditionally male things like rubbish men get. And I'm hoping this makes it to my industry, because in the film industry, costumiers, which are traditionally female jobs, get paid way, way less than all the people who do digital work for films, which is also a major thing. Weta Workshop in Wellington, Weta Digital. Weta Workshop builds stuff, costumes. Weta Digital does all the digital stuff. And all the digital people, who are mostly men, get paid way more than all the makers, although it takes more training to be a maker. So I would like to see equal pay hit my industry too, but it's not perfect everywhere, for sure. And just like most countries, women earn 79 cents to every dollar a man earns. So we're still working on it, but we can be quite feisty.
Yes, you can be quite feisty, that's right. I have met very feisty women in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Especially around Courtney Place.
Courtney Place is our main party.
There's a story about it.
It's our main party street, and it's a bit an adventure on Friday night. But I mean, alcohol makes a lot of people feisty.
Yes.
Yes.
Should I leave the room? You're looking like...
Alcohol does not make me feisty because I never drink alcohol. I've been a dud here in Germany. No schnapps for me.
Yes.
No beer, no wine.
Yes, that was difficult for my dad to understand.
Yes, and it makes me unusual in New Zealand as well.
That's true.
Yes.
Friday drinks, you know.
Yeah, but people have mostly been nice and accepting, and I just drink lots and lots of tea.
But I know a lot of New Zealanders who actually don't drink.
Yeah.
Or it is, what is it called? Dry November or something?
Dry July. We
Dry
like a
July.
rhyme.
See? July.
Yes.
Dry July and Movember and November. That was the thing.
Yes. Grow a beard to raise money for prostate cancer research, I think.
Prostate cancer, and all men run around with weird moustaches. Most of New Zealand men look utter ridiculous with moustaches.
But New Zealand men love a bad mustache. It's like somehow built into the national psyche. The worse your mustache can be, the more we love it. Which is part of, I think, a Kiwi nostalgia about the 70s and the 80s before New Zealand really opened up to the world. And so those really terrible 70s, 80s mustaches.
Shorts.
New Zealand
socks.
love, and worn with extremely short shorts and socks and sandals over your socks.
I saw those photos. Amazing.
Yeah.
Lemden Key, men in shorts and socks. It looked like Germany.
I just wanted to say, are you talking about German guys?
Yes, it's we
Yes.
just stuck to it in Germany, you know.
And then finished off with a mullet.
So is there... so what was life like during First World War?
So New Zealand's always been a long way from everything. So shipping has been a major issue. And obviously goods were really in short supply, and the price of everything went up hugely. The price of flour, I think, went up by 10 times. And then also there was a big focus on New Zealand shipping food off to the UK to supply their food shortages and shipping food off to the army. So food prices skyrocketed. There'd been some really exciting goods reaching New Zealand just before World War I. The one that really astonished me as a researcher is stainless steel. Stainless steel is invented just before World War I. And if you could buy a stainless steel knife, you don't have to clean your knife every single time you use it. Before stainless steel, slice an apple, clean your knife, or your knife rusts terribly. And your knife had to be sharpened every single day or it went dull. And I just thought, if you could have bought a stainless steel knife before World War I, the amount of time you'd save every day and not having to clean and sharpen your knives. It's a tiny thing. Who would think of it? But yes, huge difference. Also, for domestic help had always been very hard to get. Very few people in New Zealand had maids because up until World War I, New Zealand always had significantly more men than women. So young women would come out to New Zealand, and why would you be a maid for someone when you could marry someone and have a significantly higher chance of increasing your social status and your economic standing? And so companies would actually hire women from usually England, but also Germany, and offer to pay their way out and pay them money, but they'd have to sign a paper saying they wouldn't get married for a certain number of years. So, but prior to World War I, even a middle-class woman in New Zealand could at least send her laundry out every week to be done, and only, so middle and upper class could send their laundry out, and upper class might have a maid or two. And suddenly in World War I, all of these laundresses and maids can get much better paying, easier jobs in offices. And so suddenly all of these women are having to learn how to wash laundry for the first time and how to cook for the first time, and are keeping their house clean for the first time. And so we see a really amazing shift in the types of houses that are being built. And really interesting for me, the types of meals that are being eaten. And this also, World War I, just before, coincides with the introduction of electricity and the introduction of indoor plumbing and the introduction of the thing I could not possibly live without, which is running hot water in your house. That would just be, in New Zealand winters, to not have running hot water, I would cry every day. New Zealand winters are cold. New Zealand houses are terrible, cold and damp. And so meals go from being, you make your household size, average household size is 8 people. And so you're making huge meals with a bunch of different dishes, and they're meals that you put on a coal or wood stove that runs all day and heats your whole house. So they're meals that cook for hours and hours on the stove. And suddenly you have a household that's only 2 people left because all the men have gone overseas. Or women living for the first time by themselves in little tiny flats. So the newspapers are full of recipes for one-pot meals. And suddenly meals start to look like what we eat today. So I spent 2 weeks trying to live like it was 1916, wearing the clothes, so all the layers and corset, and eating the meals, and cleaning the house. And when I first told my husband I wanted to do this, he was extremely unenthusiastic. And then I revealed to him that for 2 weeks, he would not have to do a single bit of housework. And we would be eating meals that involved lots of meat and a dessert every time. And suddenly this idea was way better, and he was willing to support this. But so I did both the traditional old meals where you're making heavy pea soups and like a big meat main dish and all these side dishes and desserts. But I also found some of the newer recipes, like a very exciting make Italian pasta. And it was actually quite good. It was, although they said to boil their macaroni for an hour until it is just soft. And I don't know what kind of macaroni they were having that you could boil for an hour until it was just soft. But I followed the just soft part rather than the boil for an hour part, because maybe they dried their macaroni much more. So you boil macaroni and then you stir through Parmesan cheese and parsley. And the recipe said in Italy, they would also add lots of garlic. But of course, we think that is nasty.
So New Zealand.
Yes, it is. But it was really interesting. And I prefer not to eat meat, although I will. The really interesting thing for me was how many recipes there were for vegetarian food. And there was a newspaper in Wellington that published a daily recipe, and it would have a shopping list for tomorrow. And every recipe, if you cooked a ham, then tomorrow would be a soup that used your ham bone. So they were really recipes that built on each other. But what really amazed me is at least every other week, they had a full vegetarian meal. And so there were a lot of people in World War I New Zealand eating vegetarian meals, because otherwise, why would a newspaper publish one at least every other week? And so that was really interesting, eating like it was World War I. You see a big increase of some fish that used to be fish that nobody would bother eating, but suddenly we're shipping the good stuff overseas. So now we're eating this. Lots and lots of oysters, because those used to be very cheap. Unfortunately, my budget for this experiment did not stretch to lots of oysters. I only wish it could have. Lots of apples, because those didn't ship so well. And so lots of dishes made with apples. And whilst the meals were uniformly beige, everything pale brown. All the food, just pale brown blobs. It was actually quite delicious. And despite eating these heavy meals with like dessert and lots of carbs, I lost weight, because it is so much work to be a housewife in 1916.
Yeah.
All the cleaning and the laundry, and you're walking most places rather than a car. And then also corset kind of keeps your stomach from expanding, so you don't have as much appetite. So while it's quite a lot of work, the 1916 diet is very effective if you want to trim yourself up.
Oh my God, I'm just imagining this. No, I could do it.
Yeah.
I don't think I could do it. I have tried 1950s. That was easier. Remember we had this 1950s party once for my birthday?
Yes. Oh God. long time ago.
Long time ago, yeah.
The first few days were hard. And I did not know if I could do it. And then it got a lot easier. And I discovered some things like modern furniture is not built for sitting in corsets because we like to slouch back in modern furniture. And so, but when I looked at pictures of chairs from 1916, if I could find a chair like that from a really upright back, that was actually really comfortable in a World War I style corset. And so that was a thing. Also, a lot of sitting isn't comfortable, so you're actually moving all the time, doing housework and that sort of thing. So that is part of why you lose weight, because you do not lie around on the couch. That's not, you go and sew, you go and cook, you go and clean. I would have really I did this in the middle of winter in New Zealand. I would have really struggled to do it without hot running water inside. Like the ability to take a bath every couple of days, just without that mentally, it would have been very difficult. And the other thing, we've already talked about STDs, so I figure we can talk about this. The other thing that I would have really struggled to do is menstrual care in the teens. It was a pad and a rubber apron. But the kind of amazing thing about that is historically, people often ask this when I do costume history talks, like, what did women do when they had their period? Yeah. And historically, that's really hard to research because people didn't write about that in detail, like, you know, and like what they were using. And so we have to extrapolate from tiny mentions. But for the 1910s, we have amazing, amazing details because the British Army in particular was had all these recruited women to help with the war effort, and often very poor women, and they were sending them around, and they had just introduced sanitary pads, disposable sanitary pads. So they wrote incredibly detailed guides for women on how to use disposable sanitary pads and how to dispose of them. You were supposed to burn them in a fire. And so suddenly, for the first time ever, we have an incredibly detailed guide to what the new you know, menstrual care. And so I was able to like really go, all right, this is how we've done. But you're still wearing a sort of rubber apron that sits behind you so that if you sit and leak, it doesn't stain your skirt.
Oh my God.
And a big thing that buttons underneath you with a cotton or like a very bulky pad. And it's like wearing a diaper. And compared to all the options available today, it's cumbersome and uncomfortable.
Oh my God.
Everything you are talking about, your experience, sounds like a good concept for a reality show on TV.
It certainly would. I would be, I don't know if I want to be that kind of conspicuous. And I prefer my TV as undramatic as possible. So only if we could get the people who really did it, like the first few seasons of the Great British Bake Off, where there's been some British history programs where they've toned it down. But my experience with New Zealand television is they try to make it quite dramatic.
Drama sells.
Yeah, but actually we all loved watching the restful Great British Bake Off where everyone was nice to each other. I just want to watch restful TV programs. So I would do this if I really was sure I had a producer who would let us be like, oh, you know, not like huge crying fits about it, but a more civilized discussion about how privileged we are as women today to have the options of period knickers and cups and implants that mean you don't have it at all. And you know,
Did you document your experiments as well somewhere?
I did. It's documented on my blog, and actually there's very detailed journals that I've never gotten around to putting online in a form, but there's a lot on my blog. It's called The Fortnight in 1916, and if you Google Leimomi, you'll get me. There's only about 8 other Leimomis in the world. So I'm the most conspicuous Leimomi. So you'll find me.
But what can you tell us about the reaction when you post it and you? There must be a lot of discussion.
So there was a lot of discussion about it online. But the amazing thing about Wellington is that people dress so eccentrically in Wellington, and Kiwis are so laid back. It's great to be a celebrity in Wellington because everyone pretends they're just much too cool to notice that they're standing behind Sir Ian McKellen at the grocery store. And like, we just don't notice. And when I have encountered extremely big celebrities in Wellington, I've been like, I'm just not going to get excited that Brett McKenzie is sitting on the other end of the bench for me, eating a kebab while I have my camera out so I can show people the photograph I took of a seagull while Brett McKenzie was sitting on the other side of the bench. But I did not take a photograph of Brett McKenzie because I was a good little Wellingtonian and we do not.
We don't do that.
We
don't do that.
People don't get excited about clothes. But the thing is, 1916's clothes are actually not that weird to modern eyes. And so we're talking like a skirt that goes to high ankle, low calf, an A-line skirt, and we're talking a cardigan or a jacket that belts around your waist, and then blouses. And so I walked around Wellington for 2 weeks wearing this, going to the grocery store, doing things, and I only had 3 people react at all. So an old man in an Italian grocery store came up to me and said, "Oh, Bella, Bella," and kissed my hand. I was in actually an op shop, and I heard 2 young women discussing my outfit, and one of them was like, "I really like her look, it's really cool." And the other one said, "It's a little costumey for me, but I can see it." But here's the thing, she didn't notice it as a costume. She said a little costumey, like a little, dressed up, old fashioned, but she didn't go, "That woman is like clearly wearing costume." And then near the end of my experiment, I had brunch at a friend's house, and I'd seen this friend a couple of times in small bits during this experiment, but I hadn't actually mentioned what I was doing, and only when we had brunch did we have the time to talk about it. And she said, "Oh, I thought you just decided to dress a bit hipster for this winter." So in Wellington, 1916's clothes can actually pass as everyday ordinary wear. So I have a very Kiwi, and I fit in really well in New Zealand because I don't like being conspicuous. I don't like, I'm not a natural extrovert. I don't like being noticed in a crowd. And so it was really nice for me that I could do this for 2 whole weeks and not have people be like, "Who is that?" If I wore a hoop skirt for 2 weeks, people would notice.
I ask myself if it would work in Berlin-Prenzlberg. I think it would
Berlin
work.
it would work too. Probably no one would notice.
But walking around Essen, I've noticed a few people in like suspenders and bow ties for men.
Yeah, slowly. It's coming slowly, We're getting a bit more stylish here.
Yes. With the weather we've been having, we probably wouldn't want 1916's clothes because it has been warm. And even though they are natural fibers, that's a lot of layers to wear when it's 28 degrees and humid. Yes.
So, one question first. Is there a favorite op shop of yours in Wellington that you would like to share?
Can I do not an op shop?
Yeah.
There is a clothing store called Fruity on Cuba Street, which is like a lovely pedestrian shopping street. And Fruity is one of the few places left in Wellington where you can buy clothes that are made in Wellington. And actually, it's very likely that the woman behind the counter in Fruity will have made the garments herself. And in fact, as I say this, I am wearing a dress made in Wellington, New Zealand by Fruity. And so when I want to buy new clothes in New Zealand, that's where I go, because it's really amazing to support a business that's still making clothes right in New Zealand.
Oh, that's a good tip. She's wearing a blue dress with white dots on it. It's kind of like a bit above the knee, below the knee length, and elbow length arms. It looks kind of like a little bit 1930-ish cut.
It's very like 1930s meets 2023, because this is ruffle near the bottom. This is very much a style that everyone in Wellington is wearing with white sneakers.
Yeah. And you look stunning as usual.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so if you ever come to Wellington, now you know where to go for shopping.
Yeah.
Support the local businesses. And as usual, we're having our kupu of the day in our episodes. So this time Daniel will learn a new word, but this time not from me. He will learn it from Leimomi.
That's a very big moment for me.
So we're actually going to learn 2 words, because I work for Toi Whakari, or the full name is Te Kura o Toi Whakari o Aotearoa, but Toi Whakari is the National Drama School. So you will learn both Toi and Whakari. So Toi means art. One of its meanings is art or knowledge. So the National Museum in New Zealand has done a big, huge art exhibition called Toi Aotearoa, that just means Art of New Zealand, Art of Aotearoa. And so you'll see stores with Toi in the name, TOI, and that means that they sell some kind of art. So when you see the word toy around New Zealand, you know that refers to arts, and many museums will use that, and schools or organizations that deal with art will have the word toy in the name. Whakari can mean a number of things, but in the case of the National Drama School, whakari means dramatic. So Toi Whakari is dramatic arts, so it's the dramatic arts school. It can also just mean acting. And you might already have heard the word whakari in the news, because whakari is also known as White Island, and it is the volcanic island that really tragically erupted a couple of years ago and killed some people. And actually, the full name of that island means Dramatic Volcano Island or Dramatic Explosion Island, which should have been a hint that maybe it wasn't the safest. So Toi, art, whakari, dramatic.
So nice.
2 words.
Did you know it?
Yes, I knew, but now you have to say Toi Whakari.
We all know it.
Daniel needs to say the word now.
Okay. Sorry?
Toi Whakari.
Toi Whakari.
Yeah. So in Germany, if you see toi on a toilet somewhere on a festival, you might want to think about the meaning.
That's quite interesting. I think everyone of you will remember.
Sure, it means something entirely different.
It makes me laugh. When I see it, I'm always grinning a bit and thinking, that's weird.
Yeah, it is funny when words mean totally different things in 2 languages. And I encounter that quite a bit because I grew up in Hawaii and I speak some Hawaiian, which is linguistically very close to Te Reo Māori in New Zealand, but sometimes words change meaning just enough to have really funny things that don't quite match up, somewhat like embarrassed in English and embarazada in Spanish, where you really don't want to say that you're embarazada in Spanish unless you're pregnant. Yes.
So thank you so much, Leimomi, for giving us some time and sharing your stories. I think this has been very interesting to our listeners, because what we want to do here is sharing stories about New Zealanders and the life at the Antipode.
And most important, when people want to read more from you, then now you have the opportunity to say where they have to go to in the World Wide Web.
So my blog is the Dreamstress, or you can just Google my name, Leimomi. And since people wonder, it is a real name. It's a real Hawaiian name. I'm named after my mother's best friend, who was native Hawaiian. And there are other Leimomis. I'm not the only one in the world. But if you Google Leimomi, you'll find my blog and my Instagram. Yep.
We will put it in our show notes.
Yes.
Great idea.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun, and I just wish I had more time in Germany.
Last question. What is the most interesting thing in Germany you saw in the last days?
I have seen so many amazing things. I knew very little about Essen before I came here, and then it's just been the perfect mix of seeing the industrial history, seeing the coal mines.
Okay.
We went to Schloss Bethlen today.
Schloss Benrath.
Yes. So you excused your English. My German is non-existent and terrible. And that was like the perfect little cupcake palace. So cute. And the nature, very excited about squirrels. We have no native land mammals in New Zealand, so anytime you see like a squirrel or a bat, it's the most exciting thing in the world. So kind of everything which is not helpful. Yes, but definitely like every day I've been like, can we sit outside at dusk? Can I see the Fledermauses come in? I want to see bats flying in the street. So that's been a completely random highlight that you don't expect that someone will be so excited about.
Interesting.
I think we had a good time.
And I switched to German to say goodbye. Und ich hoffe, ihr hattet auch eine interessante Zeit. Also ich würde sagen, diese Einblicke, die wir heute bekommen haben, bekommt man ja jetzt nicht wirklich jeden Tag. Insofern danken wir dir auch nochmal. Jetzt danken wir beide jetzt auch nochmal auf...
Wir danken dir. Wir sagen ganz dolle Danke dafür, dass du da warst. Und mal gucken, vielleicht können wir noch mal was machen. Dann machen wir das online zur anderen Seite der Welt.
Genau, Gott sei Dank gibt es ja genügend Möglichkeiten, das zu tun. Also wie gesagt, wir packen euch gerne noch mal ein paar Infos in die Shownotes rein. Wir sagen danke für eure Aufmerksamkeit und hoffen, euch beim nächsten Mal wieder zu hören. Ja, bald auch sicherlich wieder mit weiteren Gästen, aber nächstes Mal werden wir auch mal wieder eine ganz reguläre Folge machen. Sagen Dankeschön an dieser Stelle und es grüßen euch
Daniel Kuhl
und Rebecca Börk. Macht's gut.
Takite.
Takite.
Whakarongo, dein Neuseeland Podcast.